Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And this is the panel on globalization and development, and I want to ask for a round of applause for the three presenters, Johan Norberg from the Cato Institute, Douglas Irwin from Dartmouth College, Felipe de la Balze, National Academy of Moral and Political Science. And as the introduction has been said, 30 years after Fukushima, and at the end of history, we are now discussing again the benefits of globalization, and this is precisely what this panel will discuss. What will we be discussing? Globalization and development. We will discuss why globalization matters, why it is important to have free trade and capitalism. We will make an overview with them about the benefits of global capitalism. We will also discuss with our panelists about the moral superiority of capitalism, and at the end of the day, to relate back to the first panel of the morning that spoke about the culture of freedom, we should think that globalization and trade is done by individuals at the end of the day. Human action is the fundamental part of globalization. Once again, I want to request all of you to give a round of applause to Johan Norberg, an academician of the Cato Institute and author specialized in globalization, human progress, and universal intellectual history. He's author and editor of more than 20 books translated in more than 30 languages, and I studied this and I recommend you. He has a web page that is called johannorberg.net, and many of the documentaries can also be seen in free-to-choose.tv. And welcome, Johan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this extraordinary event. And I'm proud to be part of such a distinguished panel from which I've learned so much, and I will keep doing that today, I'm sure. I'm excited to be here and to talk about globalization and development, especially as a Swede in Argentina. Because Swedes visiting Argentina know a thing or two about the potential of this country. Sweden's national bard, our greatest singer-songwriter, Evert Taube, he lived in Argentina in the early 20th century. And he wrote about his beloved Argentina. The beautiful nature, lovely people, but also the sense of adventure, the high-paying jobs, the future that he saw in Argentina back then. Because Argentina was then around 40% richer than Sweden was, and this was the place to go to find not just adventure, but also wealth and potential. One of Evert Taube's most famous songs is about the beautiful Carmencita, who's a great tango dancer, and he proposes to her, but she says, no, there's another guy coming, an Argentinian, and he's wealthy, he's got more cattle, and he's a great tango dancer, so I'm afraid this will not do, my dear friend. But then the roles reversed, and 100 years later, Sweden is now 4 times richer on a per capita GDP basis at current currency exchange rates. What happened in between during those 100 years? The thing that happened was that we Swedes found a machine, an incredible machine, the best imaginable machine. It's not just one that can turn Sweden's forests and timber into food, or its iron ore and steel into furniture, but actually can do the reverse and turn timber into any kind of goods, services, even software. A machine that can turn anything into anything else. Anything you got, anything that you're able to produce, and on the other side of the machine, you can take out whatever you need, whatever that happens to be. And the great thing about this incredible machine is that it's a very realistic one, and it's called global capitalism and international exchange. That beautiful machine that makes our work more valuable, our ideas more valuable, because we can turn it into anything else that we're not able to produce. So suddenly Sweden's farmers could grow cars and computers in the wheat fields. Suddenly workers at their conveyor belts could assemble financial services and cell phones, and a programmer could code himself a bottle of wine and a new sofa. This metaphor of trade as a machine tells us something important about what trade is. And the fact that the most important aspect is that we get something out of the machines. Imports, right? This is what we must remember in a neo-mercantilist era, when all the politicians and lots of big businesses say that exports are good, but imports are bad, and we should try to limit them. They're too cheap. But of course, the most important thing is not how much we put into the machine, but the fact that we can get as much as possible out of it on the other side. Exports, that's Monday morning going to work. Imports, that's payday, and obviously we want more pay from the work that we put into it. This is what trade and globalization is really about. And it shows that arguments for protectionism and tariffs are all versions of the Luddite argument, that we want less bang for our bucks. We want less goods coming out of the machines from all the work that we're producing. But not just goods and services, because this is also how we acquire capacity, acquire new ideas and new innovations. New ideas and technologies spreading around the world. That's what happened when we have access to globalization, to global markets, and to the brains and the hard work of people in other parts of the world. Combinations, new exciting things coming when ideas and technologies clash. Argentina's greatest writer, Jorge Luis Borges, he once put it this way when talking about literature, that the translation of Don Quixote, of Cervantes' Don Quixote, is far superior to the original. Not just because he loved the English language, but also because it added something new, an extra vantage point. And those combinations and those clashes, that creates magic. Like when Spanish beef cows for the first time came to Buenos Aires in the 1580s, combining it with the pampas and the fertile soil and the climate here. Or the Malbec grape came from the French to Argentina in the 1850s, combining it with the dry, sunny climate and the right altitude, and suddenly we have something great to drink to this steak that we're having. And perhaps to combine an Argentinian with Austrian economists, and suddenly we might have the best hope for American and European libertarianism that there is. Spreading the best ideas and combining the best ideas and technologies, that's what keeps us going. That's what keeps development going. Because sometimes we don't even know what our greatest contributions are. We can just put it out there and see what others prefer and what they do with it. Nobody knows our legacy. You know, Kalashnikov, the guy with the AK-47 and the AK-74, he thought that he would be remembered for his poetry. But that's not what happened, because he produced something else that was of interest to people. Something interesting, sometimes destructive, happens when you go out there and trade test your ideas, as my dear friend, the great Deirdre McCloskey, always talks about. It doesn't happen by planning, it doesn't happen by committee, it happens when you trade test and combine ideas and put them out there. Well, for a long time, many governments denied their populations access to this great globalization machine, like Argentina, for a very long time. However, in recent decades, more and more countries have opened up to the rest of the world, liberalized markets, and liberated their people. After 1990, with the fall of dictatorships and the liberalization of markets, suddenly we got an era of globalization. Capitalism was suddenly free to lapse into its most savage form, as the Canadian socialist Naomi Klein puts it. Well, let's see what that savagery really meant in terms of indicators of human living standards. If we try to measure the wealth that mankind has attained by looking at GDP per capita, around half of all the wealth that we have ever produced was produced during these years since 1990. Extreme poverty was reduced from almost 4 out of 10 people on the planet to less than 1 out of 10 people today. And it's not just about China. China liberalized markets, started to compete on international markets and did great progress until the recent backlash. But it's not just about China, which some people propose some once in a while. Even if we exclude China, extreme poverty was reduced by 2/3 around the world. The greatest and most impressive and fastest improvement of human living standards that the world has ever seen. Child mortality was reduced almost by 2/3, which means that last year 8 million child deaths were avoided, and it happened the fastest in the places that are opened up to the best ideas, technologies, goods and services from other people. And remember, this is capitalism after it had lapsed into its most savage form. So thank you, savagery. Had this been accomplished by a government program, do you think they would ever have shut up about it? I think they would have written musicals about these achievements. I think they would have erected statues and national holidays with great marching bands talking about how they finally beat global poverty. But now it just happened because people wanted to improve their lives and got a little bit more freedom to do it. And therefore, we only hear about the complaints, about greed, about inequality. We rarely think about what made this possible and why it has never been possible before in human history. There are many old complaints about globalization and free trade, but the one that has most potency right now is that, yes, it might buy us better living standards, it might make us all richer, it might reduce poverty, but at what cost? We are suddenly making ourselves dependent on fragile global supply chains, which might fracture. We saw that during the pandemic, how suddenly we didn't get access to important inputs and goods and services that we needed. And therefore, we have to start to repatriate more production. We have to have more friendshoring. We should trade more with people who are good geopolitical friends rather than people who might not have our best interest at heart. This, I think, is a complete misreading of what happened during the pandemic. In fact, the opposite happened. And repatriation and the new protectionism that we're getting and friendshoring that we're seeing will make us poorer, less productive. It would decrease specialization, but it will also make us less secure. We know that because now when we're looking into what really happened during the pandemic, the great thing was that as a friend of mine who's a little bit of a prepper, who had his basement full of canned food and fresh water, he told me that the worst year in human history to be a prepper was in 2020, during the pandemic. Because he thought that now, when the world is shutting down and more than half the world's population is under house arrest, finally you will not mock me anymore for having all this canned food in my basement. But on the contrary, you will beg me for these resources. But he found out that in a matter of days, sometimes hours, all those goods were back on shelves, anywhere where we have relatively free markets and free trade. And who did best? Which businesses and countries did best? Counterintuitively, those with the most complex supply chains were fastest at putting goods back onto the shelves, because they were used to looking for alternatives. And they invested more in their trading partners. And they were used to constantly maneuvering to find new opportunities in other places. Whereas those who had short, simple supply chains, only one supplier, well, if that supplier happened to be in a place under lockdown or a natural disaster, then that's game over. Only the ones with more complex supply chains prospered in this situation. And we saw that again in 2022 with infant baby formula in the United States, one sector that had really been repatriated, with regulations that made it impossible even to import infant formula from Europe, and to tariffs that made it impossible to import it from the rest of the world. Felt safe, everything was repatriated. It was close at hand, right? That's great. if it weren't for the fact that then all it takes is problems in one production facility in the spring of 2022, and you end up with a national shortage. That's what happened with close, short supply chains. It sounds counterintuitive, but you've heard it before. That's why the old saying does not go, put all your eggs in one basket and protect it with regulations and tariffs. Because one basket of eggs is one single point of failure. If you fail there, it's game over. We shouldn't concentrate risks, we should diversify risks as much as possible, and that's what globalization and trade helps us do. Even diversifying it to some of our geopolitical rivals, and to have that opportunity. Anytime when people talk to me about friendshoring, I think about what happened in Europe in early 2020. There were a few countries that tried to stop countries like Sweden, Spain, and Italy from getting face masks and getting access to personal protective equipment. And that was Germany and France, some of our best geopolitical allies and friends. We love them. But they imposed export bans, and more than that, France even confiscated protective equipment just going through France on the way to another country somewhere else. The country that saved us was China, because they suddenly scaled up production to more than 3 times the global production in 2019 and exported it to the rest of the world. Not because Xi Jinping is a better friend of ours than France and Germany, but because we were already dependent on France and Germany. They're close to us, and most disasters, most problems are local and regional by nature. That's a single point of failure. We need the same stuff at the same time. So having diversified risks and being able to buy from factories that happens to be not under lockdown for that particular moment is good. Geopolitical sentimentality, there's a place for that, but not when it comes to trade. Then diversification is more important. So there we have it. I don't think the new arguments stand up against trade either. The case for this incredible machine of globalization is stronger than ever. The opponents keep coming up with theoretical challenges, and that's why we do what we do. But as Borges put it, the world, unfortunately, is real. And you can't wish it away, and you can't wish the facts away. The track record is absolutely clear. Globalization is still the best hope for development and for mankind. But it's not predetermined, it's not automatic, it's a choice that we have to do. To Swedes in the 1910s and 1920s, Argentina was the country of the future, the country of opportunity and adventure. By tearing down self-imposed barriers, it could be so once again. Thank you.
Qué gran orador para esta tarde.
What a wonderful guest speaker this afternoon. Now we are going to welcome another guest speaker for our specific panel, Globalization and Development. Please, you can unload the Rebirth of Liberty app and send your questions that will be read out in our Q&A session. Douglas Irwin is a professor of economics, Dartmouth College, author of many books, Free Trade and Fire 2020. Professor Irwin is also an associate of research of the National Bureau of Economic Research and senior fellows in the Peter Institute for International Economists. Douglas Irwin, thank you so much for joining us. A big round of applause for him as well.
And Johan gave a tremendous introduction to this topic of globalization and freer trade. And I'd like to drill down just a little bit and provide some more context on what's been going on in the past few decades in the trade, and in particular, what the implications are for Argentina going forward. So, there's free trade in theory, and then there's free trade in practice. I have this book called Against the Tide, an intellectual history of free trade, which goes through the theory, starts well before Adam Smith, but talks about Adam Smith as being a very important person in developing the ideas. And then it talks about the various attacks that have been made on free trade over the years and how the idea still sustains, it's still with us, it still matters. But regardless of the theory, what about practice? How does free trade work out in practice? And it turns out that we have had a test of free trade in practice during a very particular decade, the decade from 1985 to 95 into 2005 or so, so about 20 years. I put neoliberalism in quotation marks. It's often called the neoliberalism era, a lot of critics, but it was a historically unique period in human history in terms of opening up and creating the globalized world that we have today, as you so eloquently pointed out. Many countries, not just China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Chile before them, so many countries opened up. And what did we see during that period? Impressive global growth, convergence in incomes, poverty reduction, and the unfortunate thing is Argentina missed out on a lot of it. Although they did have their era, and we are here in Puerto Madero, which is a legacy of the 1990s and the liberalization that took place then. But Argentina, I think, can recapture some of those benefits. So this is just a picture showing the number of countries that opened up. Going back to 1960, and you can see very few in the 60s, very few in the 70s. Chile was on the vanguard. But from 1985 to 95, the world changed. So many countries opened up. There's not just the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course that was very important, but it created the globalized world we're in today. And what happened? Robert Lawson will speak a little bit later. He has the Index of Economic Freedom. The world is sort of flat here in terms of this freedom to trade. This is an index of freedom to trade. It's sort of flat until 1985. It begins to pick up until 1995 or 2000 or so, and it sort of tailed off. But there's that convergence. The rest of the world moved towards more open markets and more freedom to trade. Tariffs came down across the developing world. They're already relatively low in the United States and Western Europe, but in the developing world, South America, South Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, those tariffs were very high starting in 1980, but between 1980, 85 or so, and 1995, they came down. Once again, this changed the world in which we live. This is just a way of thinking about globalization. This is the world trade to GDP ratio. It's one indicator about how integrated the world economy is. World trade to world GDP, going back to 1820. And you can see that first era of globalization. There are 5 eras of globalization. The first era, that's when Argentina did so well, particularly towards the end of that. The world trade to GDP ratio is rising a bit. Then we hit era 2, the interwar period, where there's this implosion, protectionism, economic nationalism, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Great Depression. Global integration shrinks. In phase 3, we have this rebound after World War II. The US helps create the GATT, and we start moving towards lower trade barriers, at least in North America, Western Europe, and elsewhere. But it's really this period 4, where we have this explosion in globalization. And so many more countries become part of the global economy. Now we're unfortunately in period 5, where it's flat, and countries are not liberalizing. But I want to talk about the legacy of that period 4, when globalization is taking off. So what do the studies show, the academic studies show about income as a result of countries opening up? Here's one study by 2 colleagues of mine. Is Washington Consensus dead? Here's the bottom line. They divide the world into countries that liberalized and those that did not. And once again, liberalization starts in the mid-1980s, and by the early 2000s, those countries that liberalized enjoyed a higher per capita income, about 15 to 20% above those that did not liberalize. Higher incomes, more gains from trade, productivity growth, product variety. There's so many ways you can document this. They did better. Here's another study using synthetic control methods. We don't have to get into the details. It's trying to come up with a plausible counterfactual path for a country that does not liberalize. And it goes through all these scenarios, looks at Costa Rica, Mexico, Barbados, and the actual performance is much better than a counterfactual in which the country did not liberalize. But guess what? You don't have to read all those studies or understand the econometrics or the details. I summarized it all in an article that's coming out in the World Bank Research Observer, it's on my website. It's just a review of all the evidence from that period, and just summarizes all the studies. There's more than a dozen of them, and they're almost uniform. It's not like this one hand on the other hand, we don't know what happened. All the studies looking at different methods, different countries, different data, come to the same conclusion. big benefits from trade liberalization. What country is this? Well, why am I showing a picture? We can do all these academic studies, we can study the data, but seeing is believing. What city is this? It's not a rhetorical question, but I'll answer it. This is Seoul, Korea in 1965. What are the people doing? They're washing their clothes in the river. What does South Korea export now around the world? Washing machines. This is South Korea, downtown Seoul in 1960. Here's that same river today. South Korea's exports as a share of GDP in 1960 was 1%. 1% of GDP. That's an incredibly small trade ratio because they're incredibly isolated from the world economy. Now, of course, the Korean trade to GDP ratio and import to GDP ratio is about 30–40% or so. So they have taken advantage of global trade. Deirdre McCloskey mentioned India. India's flourished since 1991 and getting rid of the license raj. But what's unheralded is Bangladesh also opened up. You don't hear about them. When I was growing up, Bangladesh was considered one of the poorest countries in the world. And now it has overtaken India in terms of per capita GDP. They have been a quiet, stealth reformer, and their trade to GDP ratio has soared, and they've brought millions of people out of poverty. In fact, let's look at poverty, as Johan was mentioning. This is going back to 1900, world extreme poverty. You know, it's going down a bit, but it's not going very fast. And what happens after 1980 or 85 when we have this globalization era? It plummets. As Johan mentioned, this is not just China. Take out China, the numbers still go down a lot because it's Bangladesh and India and Vietnam and so many other countries around the world. And this is revolutionary. It is world historic. Deirdre McCloskey, myself, we're economic historians. Economic historians will be studying this for many decades to come. The story from the Industrial Revolution up to the present has been increased global inequality. Some countries industrialized, others didn't. The gap between the rich and poor got wider and wider. There's the global Gini coefficient going up, up, up. Lant Pritchett, a famous development economist, wrote an article for the Journal of Economic Perspectives called Divergence Big Time. The world is diverging. What has happened in the 20 years since the 1990s or so in the liberalization? Boom. It undid, the world undid a century of increased inequality in 20 years because of the rise of developing countries that opened up and participated in global markets. And this was not a race to the bottom. It didn't bring down the advanced countries. It's the convergence process of other countries getting better technology and improving their standards of living. So let's turn to Argentina, which except for the 1990s seemed to have missed this. If we go way back, this is the trade to GDP ratio for Argentina, how well Argentina is integrated in global markets, going back to 1913. And what you can see is, up to the Belle Epoque, Argentina was a huge trader. The export plus import as a share of GDP ratio is about 80%, meaning exports are about 40% of GDP, imports are about 40% of GDP. And then it just falls because of greater protectionism, economic nationalism, Peronism, and it remained flat for so long at about 20%, meaning the export or import to GDP ratio is about 10%, much smaller than otherwise would have been the case. As some colleagues put it, Argentine trade policy is 60 years of solitude, 60 years of not being a big part of the global economy. Withdrawing voluntarily from world trade. It wasn't the rest of the world rejecting Argentina. It was Argentina saying, we're not prepared to trade with the rest of the world. So where's Argentina today? If you look at just array countries, in terms of how, are you open or are you closed? Where's Argentina? Way down there with Brazil. Relatively closed economy. If we look on the left-hand side here, effective applied tariffs, taxes on imports. Way off of Chile, Mexico, the OECD, Argentina, and Brazil stand alone. On the right-hand side, we have barriers to trade facilitation. Our government's interfering with trade, not through tariffs, but through, are they facilitating trade or not? Argentina, once again, is an outlier. It's not facilitating trade. It creates barriers to trade. More average tariffs. Once again, Argentina's off the charts. It's not a normal country in terms of participating in world trade. And you in Argentina know this. Prices are so much higher for these basic consumer goods that everyone in the rest of the world enjoys, and Chileans enjoy at world prices, much more expensive. My gosh, in Argentina you make cell phones in Tierra del Fuego. To the rest of the world that seems mind-boggling. Why would you produce them near Antarctica, so far from markets, when the cost is so high? Inward FDI stock. Argentina is not a place where there's a lot of inward foreign direct investment. Multinationals don't want to set up here. Once again, very low compared to the OECD average or other countries. Multinationals, they bring in technology, they bring in ideas, they bring in capital. You should be welcoming that, not rejecting it. All these problems, it's easy to blame past policies or politicians. Raul Prebisch, sort of the intellectual forefather of import substitution. This is a report in 1950 which sort of outlined all the problems Latin America might have with trade and why it might want to restrict trade. He recognized within 10 years of writing that report there were big problems with import substitution. In 1961, he said it's been carried out with very serious flaws. In 1964, he said it's created all these vested interests and prejudice as opposed to trade, and has a severe effect on economic development, that attitude. So if he had been alive today and seen what's happened with the globalized world, even he might have said import substitution is not the way to go. So what does Argentina have to do? Learn from other countries. Other countries made this transition. Other countries opened up, other countries flourished, so what's the recipe? What do you have to do? All these other countries in the 1980s and 90s, when they opened up, if you look at them country by country, they did three things. They established a convertible currency. They converted quantitative restrictions on imports to import tariffs. Why? Because QRs are very restrictive and they don't raise revenue. Tariffs at least raise revenue, and then you can cut those tariffs over time. Now, trade economists such as myself, we tend to focus on those last two. Okay, get rid of quantitative restrictions on imports and cut tariffs. That's sort of almost the easy part of it. The first part, which often gets unnoticed and is very important for Argentina, is establishing a convertible currency. What all these other countries did is they had to devalue because they have an overvalued exchange rate, and an overvalued exchange rate is a killer of trade and a breeder of trade restrictions. You want to get rid of the black market premium, you want to unify the exchange rate, you don't want 7 exchange rates, you want 1. And that allows you to end import licensing. Why do you license import? Because you have to ration foreign exchange because your exchange rate's out of whack with market reality. It's overvalued. And then maintain a competitive real exchange rate thereafter. So exchange rate policy is very important in the opening up process, and Argentina has to get that right. So just to go back to the history for a moment, what was the big problem in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? So many countries around the world had overvalued currencies. They had high rates of inflation, they didn't adjust the nominal exchange rate, and they priced their exports out of the world markets, created excess demand for imports that you have to satisfy with import licensing. And that began to come down in the 80s and 90s. There's the number of countries with non-unified exchange rates. In other words, having multiple exchange rates. Once again, this reform era of the 1980s and 90s, it collapses. Countries are unifying their exchange rates and opening up their current account for payments purposes. They may still have high tariffs, but at least the current account is open for business. And this has been a chronic problem in Argentina. Here's the black market premium on the exchange rate from 1950, and it's up and down a lot, but look at the scale. The lowest is 50 here, and we're going up to 100, 200, 300%. If it's at 30 or 40, that's already a tax on your exports. It's an overvalued currency. The peso has been chronically overvalued with just a few periods where it's not. When you look at an index of how open is Argentina to current account transactions on the trade account, it's not saying whether tariffs are high or low, but can you make payments? Can you buy imports? Can you get foreign exchange to do that? It's incredibly volatile. There are big periods of tightness where it's going down almost to zero. Very few periods where it's free, like close to 100, which is the 1990s under Cavallo. Comes back down under the Kirchners, back up under Macri. But when you look at the correlation between these two, it's almost perfectly negatively correlated. What does that mean? If you have an overvalued currency, you're going to close up the current account. You're going to restrict access to foreign exchange. And it doesn't matter whether the tariff is 0 or 100%, you can't get foreign exchange to buy imports anyway. So what's the point of those tariffs? Argentines, you've been through this under the Kirchners recently with the non-automatic import licensing from 2012 to 2015. Look at the lower panel. It shows the nominal exchange rate in blue, and then the market, the parallel market, the black market rate. The gap is widening, so what happens? Reserves, foreign exchange reserves go down, and the percent of imports that are approved by the government go down. In other words, the government's just basically banning imports to preserve foreign exchange reserves because the exchange rate is out of whack. Even today, there's a gap between the official rate and the parallel market rate. And even though the current government just had a big devaluation early on, they didn't go down to the market rate. And they've had this crawling depreciation of about 2%, but inflation is higher, so that gap has been widening, which means the real exchange rate has been appreciating. And here's just a picture of this. So this is a little bit confusing because exchange rates up and down can mean different things. Up here means a depreciation, a down means an appreciation. So notice what's happening. It's been going down, which means the real value of the peso has been appreciating. It's been going this way. There's that big devaluation, but notice just 2 or 3 months, 4 months later, it's already wiped out because of higher inflation. The exchange rate adjustment has not kept up with the pace of inflation. The real value of the peso has gone up. That's a tax on exporters, and that creates problems for the central bank in terms of its reserves. So, former foreign minister of Argentina said being closed to the world has not brought us good results. We see that the world has become protectionist, nationalist, populist, and we have done our master's, doctorate, and postdoctoral degrees in that. We see it does not work. Having a closed economy has not worked for Argentina. At some point, once there's macroeconomic stability, the government has to move towards opening up markets and getting access and becoming part of the world economy once again. And so that's what Argentina needs ultimately, to move towards a more open economy market economy. That means a convertible currency with one exchange rate, not 7, not 2. That means no black market premium. And then you can undertake these unilateral reforms. I'll leave it to others on the panel to talk about things, but one idea, leave Mercosur. That's a protectionist racket. Just as Chile, you don't want to be tied to the high tariffs of Brazil. You want to strike out on your own the way Chile did in pulling out of the Andean Pact in the mid-1970s and go for free trade unilaterally, as so many other countries have. Last point is, you got to get the exchange rate right, and do not fix the exchange rate. It's going to blow up. It happened in Chile in the 1980s. It happened in Mexico in the mid-1990s. It happened here in Argentina in 2000, 2001. You've got to let the exchange rate go, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to maintain open markets. You'll create a macroeconomic crisis, and that will undermine all the progress that will be made under this administration. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Douglas.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas. Impressive. Our superheroes of globalization. As speakers, I don't promise any light at the end of the tunnel, but a good coffee at the end of this panel. Anyhow, when we discussed with them about the panel, how we would go about it, one of the questions we made to ourselves is why speak about globalization today? Why is globalization important for Argentina today? What can we learn from other countries? And this is what our next panelist, Felipe de la Balze, will discuss. A round of applause to him. He is a member of the Academia de la Empresa and Moral and Political Development, and member also of Globalization and Libertad y Progreso. And we invite you now to be here to discuss this with us about globalization and development. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the Libertad y Progreso think tank for this opportunity to be with you today and to make some reflections about the Argentine situation today, what is happening around the world, and the big changes that are taking place and what we could do and what we must do. Regarding the situation of Argentina, I would like to give you some data, and I apologize because they will not be very nice probably to you, probably depressing, but they are very consistent to what has been expressed by Douglas Irwin during his presentations for data of insertion of Argentina into the world. The openness coefficient, imports plus exports divided by 2, divided by GDP, 13%. We are among the 10 most closed countries in the world. Share in the international trade scenario, 1940, our participation was 2.5% of the world economy in terms of trade, 2.5%. Today, 0.25, 10 times less than 1950, a big decline, a big drastic fall, and it has lasted over time. It has been very dramatic. And the third point, if we take a look at the pattern of trade, we have a pattern of trade which is highly concentrated, a few goods in few destinations and very few companies. 70% of our exports are agricultural goods or agribusiness. We have a few other goods, but they are the most common ones. If we take a look at the number of companies, 35% of the companies account for 65% of our exports. 35% is not over the last few years, but of the last 40 years, of 35 years. We have had a concentration of businesses that export. So what I was going to say was not very positive. Direct foreign investment. Typically, Argentina invested and received about 2% of the GDP in direct foreign investment, but it has fallen to 0.5% the last 20 years. We received less than Peru, Chile, Colombia, and many other countries. Almost of the direct foreign investment we have had in the last few years, except for lithium and non-renewable energies and some exceptions in agriculture and agrobusiness, have been the reinvestment of profits. So we have an outlook here that I would say that is very negative, that is very long-standing in time. But why is it happening to us? Why? Why do I give you these numbers and you're not shocked? Why are you not shocked? Because these figures have gone for many years now. And there are people who say that the world discriminates against us. The world discriminates against everybody. There are people who say that Argentine business people are incapable of exporting. That is not true, obviously. There are others who say that we do not have commercial or international relevant trade agreements because we don't have an FTA with the US, Europe, and Japan. We cannot participate in the world trade. That's not true. If we signed FTAs with the main countries in the world, today, the situation that I have described and that described by the doctors before me will not change. What is the problem in essence that we have is a bad macroeconomy, a macroeconomy that is not working. The first condition to be able to be inserted in the world is for the economy to work domestically first. And as it was explained by Dr. Irwin, and you know that, inflation that is permanent, fiscal deficit that is overwhelming, excessive public spending, high taxation, exchange controls, financial crises that are recurrent, then non-compliance with the foreign debt agreement. That has created a malaise, a disease of Argentina that has made Argentina practically or virtually isolated from the world in 40 years. This has not changed over the last 40 years. What can we do about it? Well, the first thing we should do is to organize our macroeconomy. We have discussed this extensively during this conference, but without a deep reorganization of our macroeconomy, without stability and fiscal stability and an organized state, and without these reforms that are important, that are under discussion today, plus the deregulation, the country does not have any possibility to be reinserted in the world. If we don't do that, we will worsen more and more as we have done in the last 40 years. But the second important thing here is not only to recognize the origin of our evils, or our problems, our perils, that is not the lack of international trade agreements, but the instability of our macroeconomic policies and the instability of our economic system and regime over the last 50 years. That's the reason for it. What do we do about it? Well, to recognize our problems is the first thing to do, and to organize the macroeconomy, deregulate the economy, to make structural reforms, and to do what we have discussed, or what we are claiming to do now. The second thing is to understand where is the world going. Well, the world is undergoing very profound changes over the last 5 years, especially. Globalization as you know it, which represented a fabulous success. There were winners and losers. Argentina was a loser in that. There's no doubt about it. Other countries were winners. Israel, Chile, Turkey was a winner. Many countries in Europe and of Eastern Europe and Western Europe, we were a loser there. But that world, the world of globalization after 1947, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, is now collapsing. The world is changing very profoundly now as a result of a new variable here, which is geopolitics. Geopolitics is crossing adversely globalization. What used to be a globalization based in economic efficiency and allocation of resources based on economic calculus is now profoundly impacted by the competition that is being given between China and the US. This competition between these two countries is held in several fields. Economic field is one of them. And you'll know that government of Trump set very high tariffs on imports from China and technological restrictions prohibiting the export of new technologies and semiconductors, telecommunications and defense industry, which prevented the introduction of Chinese companies into the US. In other words, both in the field of trade, commerce, and technology, there were a series of barriers that were surprising. Because what is surprising over the last 10 years is not the emergence of China as a trade power, but the nationalism of the US. It is much more shocking because they owned the circus. They promoted globalization over the last 40 or 50 years. They led the process of globalization, and now they have turned and decided that the geopolitical conditions of rivalry with China are sufficiently high in order to be able to change their economic approach, and they have started in the US to impose a climate of nationalism and protectionism in many activities in the world, and we need to take that into account if we want to integrate ourselves into the world, as Professor Irwin is proposing that we do as a country. But what are those conditions of what has happened in the US? First, you know that Trump set some technological restrictions in the trade with China and high tariffs, and Mr. Biden reinforced those conditions, continued with the high tariffs and the restrictions on the transfers from technology in China, and made a gigantic industrial program. The three programs that the U.S. has launched, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and Infrastructure Act, together are $1 trillion. They are programs for industrial development and industrial policy that are totally contradictory to the multilateral agreements and the World Trade Organization of the last 30 years. We have gone into a world where the main players, particularly the U.S., but also Europe and China, which is also always a mercantilistic power, are now playing a very different game than they played in the last 40 years. this will have some important consequences on us because we want to open to the world, we want to be integrated, to trade with the world, we want to leave behind what Irwin said regarding the closeness of the Argentine economy, but we need to do it in this new context, in the new political, technological, and commercial context, which is very different from what we saw in the last 50 years. We couldn't do it when it was easy, and we have to do it now when it's more difficult to us. Is it bad? Not necessarily bad. I want to remind you of the 19th century in Argentina. The big success between 1850 and 1930 was a world where there was no GATT, there was no World Trade Organization or monetary fund. There were spheres of influence, there were free trade. The Germans had their own area of influence in the center of Europe, the North Americans, the US. In Central America, there were spheres of influence, and this is precisely what is happening today. In spite of that, Argentina was able to find a way to develop itself and to take advantage of globalization at that time, to export, to bring investments, to bring immigrants, to have a formidable success. But how did we do it at that time? We had macroeconomic policies that were reasonable. That's the main problem that has really sunk us in the last 50 years. If we do not have those macroeconomic policies, the possibilities to insert ourselves in the world is insignificant. So let's assume that we're successful, that we can reestablish the macroeconomic order to be sustainable, to be long-lasting, that we can deregulate our economy, that we can reform our economy, that we can go back to give dynamism to the economy and to give the capacity of investment to the private sector. Let's assume we are able to do that through the reforms we are trying to carry out, and we hope that we can achieve that. In spite of that, the world is very different from what it was in 70 years ago. How are we going to do it then? How did we do it in the 19th century? Well, at that time, Argentina signed 20 bilateral agreements, the first one with the UK in 1822, the second with the US, 1823. Then we signed with Denmark, with Switzerland, Japan, with the Prussian state before Germany was created. 20 bilateral agreements were signed. How did we call them? We called them navigation, friendship, and commerce agreements. These were agreements that set the conditions for the trade and friendship, exchange, investment, movement of people between the signatories. And in addition to that, there were two significant clauses. There was a national treatment and the more favorable nation. If we signed an agreement with the Danish, and 3 years ago with the Dutch, we would offer then first to the Danish the possibility for their companies and the people who wanted to come to Argentina to invest to have the same treatment as the Argentines. And second, the most favored nation clause allowed to ensure them that what we gave to the UK or the Dutch could be extended to them. And that was the basis and the foundation for our success between 1880 and 1930. Without multilateral organizations, without the magnitude with a world war. So although the world was much more difficult at the time, we were able to identify the goods and services for which we had advantage, the need to negotiate, to open, to take part in the world economy as it was, not as we imagined. What can we do in the short term now? Well, I believe that one of the things is to enable the sectors that potentially have a potential for growth and economic development and investment, such as agriculture, farming, the food industry, mining, energy, should be facilitated, should be opened the way for them to be able to advance, for the private sector to invest without restrictions, with the lowest amount of restrictions for them to be able to grow. Having done that, and ensuring first a macroeconomy that should be sound and stable and long-lasting, there will emerge many other sectors. Argentine entrepreneurs and business will find many things to invest on, to import, to export. Many companies around the world will be interested in Argentina if we offer them the adequate framework for their investments and for their activities. And in that regard, although the world may be changing in a direction that may not be most favorable to us or our interest, and the previous world was actually not the same, and did not take advantage. But there's no reason to believe that we can seize the opportunity if we really want to adapt in terms of the macroeconomic policy internally, domestically, with the deregulation, privatization, incentives to the private sector, recognizing that the world is different now. Negotiations will be different. There won't be large free trade agreements. There will be probably bilateral agreements on lithium, on copper, on food security with the countries that have food insecurity, that there will be a multitude of bilateral agreements that will allow us to open our economy and take part in the world economy. And another pending issue here, and Professor Irwin also made a comment, is the question of Mercosur that has two characteristics: the intra-Mercosur trade, which is very modest. The entire intra-Mercosur trade as a percentage of the 4 member countries represent only 50% of the total trade. Equivalent in NAFTA is 37%, in the EU 63%. We trade very little between ourselves within Mercosur. Brazil and Argentina have been very protectionist. They have a number of limitations that regarding international behavior. Brazil has not been willing, and Argentina has followed the same example, to carry out international negotiations to open the economy and negotiate with other countries of Mercosur as a platform for negotiation has been almost useless. For internal trade, it has been limited. It has to be reformed. It has to be reformed, not relaunched. What are the ways to go about it? One is a proposal by Minister Guedes and Bolsonaro that meant the following: to lower the tariffs within Mercosur, which are high, up to 35% are the tariffs, effective tariffs, up to 35% within Mercosur, to lower them by 50%, to reduce the non-tariff barriers between Mercosur, and to go out to aggressively negotiate. That what Guedes and Bolsonaro intended to do 3 or 4 years ago, but it was rejected by Argentina. The tariffs were reduced 10% in a particular go. From 30%, it went to 27%, a very minor impact. The second way that I recommend could be done is to transform this in a free trade area, as it was proposed by Uruguay during the last 5 years, to recover the autonomy as to the commercial policy. Try to make Mercosur to increase its internal trade by reducing the customs tariffs, promoting the trade, and to allow the countries, any of the countries, to negotiate outside regarding the commercial openness. And the second path, I believe, is most likely because Brazil, I don't think that Brazil under the Lula administration and his economic team will actually maintain a very high protectionism in the Brazilian economy. I think I have covered the problems of Argentina, why we have changed so little in the last 40 years, what is happening to us, a macroeconomic problem, lack of stability in the macroeconomy, what we should be doing. Well, thank you very much. I hope we see you again soon.
Muchas gracias, Felipe. Como nuestros panelistas se atuvieron.
Thank you, Felipe. As our guest speakers have stuck to the agenda, we have time for the Q&A session. Johan, a question to you. Do you think that it is important to eliminate tariff barriers so as to trade between countries so that there is a voluntary trade system among countries? That is to say that resources may reach where the market indicates should reach.
slight disjunction in the translation, my machine. But as I understand the question, open up markets for trade in resources generally, I think is an incredibly important part of global trade, because it's generally a way of making sure that places with abundance can fill the areas of shortages. And that's important for simple economic reasons, that if you have those resources, you'll be better paid for them, and if you don't, you'll get access to them. That's good enough in itself, but that's also important to make sure that we reduce international tensions. One reason why history has been a long list of endless wars is that the only way to get access to the resources, natural resources, energy resources, and other goods, was to steal it from others. The fact that we can suddenly trade them across borders is not sufficient to make sure that we have eternal peace, but it will at least impose some sort of constraint and approach the 19th century free traders ideal that instead of having soldiers crossing borders, goods and resources will.
Muchas gracias, Douglas. Irwin, yo tengo una pregunta acá que tiene que ver.
Thank you, Irwin. This has to do with your book, Free Trade Under Fire, year 2020. 30 seconds. Why free trade under fire? Can you explain to us why you chose that book and the causes for that book?
The question was about my book, Free Trade Under Fire. I'm not very good at coming up with book titles, but I like that one because it's evergreen. There will never be a time when free trade is not under fire. In fact, I think it's in its 5th edition. The first edition I wrote in 2001 or so because of the attacks made at the Seattle summit of the WTO, when there were riots in the streets of Seattle against the WTO and against globalization, by, in my view, misguided protesters who didn't think globalization would do much for global poverty, that would just help out multinational companies and hurt workers around the world. And I just wanted an accessible alternative to a textbook that would lay out the case for free trade, the case against protection, the case why it's in the interest of developing countries to embrace open markets, why fears about the WTO as being this big government that's going to tell countries what to do is wrong. And what I found is that every 3 or 4 years, there's new empirical evidence, of course, but the fire directed at free trade changes. So now it's national security and global supply chains. Under Trump, it was Make America Great. We need protectionism, and it worked in the past. No, it didn't. But so about every 3 to 5 years or so, I need to come out with a new edition just to address the new, it's sort of like whack-a-mole. New arguments crop up against globalization or free trade, and they need to be beaten down.
I love that book. It's a classic. I love the title as well. But I would love to see a future where we've won the argument, and you can have a new edition called Free Trade on Fire.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Bueno, y de paso también el libro de...
And also your book, Johan's, The Capitalist Manifesto. Maybe we can make comments on your book, Johan. But I have a question to you, Felipe. I don't know if your mic is working. Is it okay? Okay. Okay. Your question. Can you enlarge on comments 1.5 minutes in relation to the Ukraine-Russian conflict and the Argentinian position? From the standpoint, economic or political standpoint, well, you may understand it as you like it. From the economic standpoint, the crisis in Europe is very important indeed, because beyond the US-China crisis, in Europe and in world trade, we have introduced the concept of sanctions. Of course, there were limited sanctions for North Korea, Iran, because they had nuclear power, but sanctions have become widespread as the WTO does no longer exist. Everything we are doing in the midst of this conflict because China and the USA has to do with the fact that we are dealing with the sanctions imposed by European countries against Russia and vice versa. And we are creating a world, or they are creating a world where free trade, transfer of technology, and overall changes are gaining a geopolitical dimension which goes beyond the dimension we have been seeing over the last 60 years. So this is a major trigger for attacking world peace, affecting world economy, and we have to take into account when we define our strategy. But we cannot have a strategy, a foreign strategy in Argentina, if we do not organize our domestic economy. Macroeconomics and structural reforms are of the essence, a prerequisite for our insertion into the world at large. Thank you so much, Felipe. Thank you so much. All right. All right. Thank you so much. You are really respecting your time. I have a question which is very complicated indeed to any of you, which is the role of cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance in the new multipolar world.
Well, we don't know, and that's why we have to leave it to the market to find out with experiments and trade test it and see what happens. But alternatives are always useful and welcome.
Bueno, y en el mismo, para cualquiera de los tres, ¿qué lugar ocupan las pymes en la globalización?
Which is the role of SMEs to you, which is the role of SMEs to you in the midst of globalization? I think that in Argentina, we have focused on agriculture, agribusiness, mining, energy. If we can stabilize our economy seriously, if we create a stable economy, consistent, and of course, durable in the course of time, Argentina is no different from Italy. 50% of our population come from Italians. We have a lot of exporting SMEs. We can become a major exporting country with major exporting SMEs without subsidies or benefits, but with macroeconomic benefits, so that the effort of the fruit of their effort will produce gains, and they are respected as SMEs. Thank you so much, SMEs. A big round of applause for our three panel members on globalization and development. Thank you so much for your attention.